Thank you all so much for coming tonight. I was thrilled when Grant or Lindsey or whoever it was asked me to talk with Lindsey tonight, because not only has she done everything that Grant said, but she's done something perhaps even more valuable, which is to provide the perfect response to all those emails that all of us are going to start receiving now that it's vacation season, asking what to do in Paris. All you have to do is cut and paste the link to Lindsey's book from Amazon. I mean, I've really done this. Like, people send the email and then I just say, just buy this book, and they're thrilled. It works. So I feel like I should be giving her the expat version of the Légion d'honneur or something tonight. But it really is kind of a public service for people who are looking to find the spirit of Paris as it is today, all in one place. And I honestly have started using it as a reference book. So thank you, Lindsey.
Thank you for saying
This is what I pick up when I'm trying to find out where to go out to dinner or where to go shopping. I think it would be nice to start just with something really basic. You make a distinction between Paris, which is the place, where we live, and Paris in italics. Paris, the iconic destination. So what's the difference? How do you identify it? And do they ever overlap? Are they two totally different cities, or?
I think it's a really good question that you start with, because that's sort of what motivated the writing of this book. Almost everything that I saw coming out about Paris continued to package it in this framework of Paris, the postcard city, Paris, a living museum, and I was sort of, what I was seeing and what I was living was so different from that. Yes, people who live in the 7th arrondissement and have a view of the Eiffel Tower, some of those people I know personally, are very lucky and get to see that every day, but that is not the reality for most people. They have daily lives that involve doing, silly, uninteresting, unglamorous things like going to the bank and fighting with your delivery guy and all of those sorts of things. And so I was seeing this repeat representation of Paris that I didn't think accurately not only captured what daily life is like, but captured what's so beautiful about Paris, which goes far beyond all of the monuments and all of the very immaculate parks and these beautiful boulevards, and I wanted to offer something more. So yeah, I would say that there's part fantasy, and that's the things we've imagined thanks to books over generations being written about this city, movies and postcards and all of these representations of Paris, this playground for romantics, but that's not entirely the true story. That's not the full picture.
Right. Okay, well, I wanted to ask you, for people who maybe aren't familiar with your blog or the book, to read a short passage which kind of embodies a lot of what I love about the book. It's substantive, it's grounded in fact, it's generous to the past, present, and future of Paris, and it's opinionated. So let's see, I've highlighted a little section for you about
it's from the food section,
yes,
which
about the
is
new
pretty meaty.
bistro. So
okay. So this is under the section, this is in the food and dining section, which is one of the biggest, sort of a meaty to use a relevant word, a part of the book, because so many of the palpable changes have happened in food and dining, but that's only one piece of
right.
the book,
I mean,
of
why don't you just tell people it's 6 sections?
Yeah, so
right?
there are 6 sections, food and dining, there's one on evolutions in pastry, in specialty coffee, in libations, so that covers craft beer, natural wine, and craft cocktails. Shopping in crafts, which also looks at sort of this return of craftsmanship and how you're going to seek out very interesting goods that are beyond the things you're going to find in other global cities. And then places and spaces, so how Parisians can reconnect with the city thanks to different sorts of hangouts, thanks to initiatives by the city to make the city to make life better for locals. So this particular section talks about the rise of the neo-bistro, which of course is perhaps a term you've heard a lot about, but maybe you're not sure about who's behind that and why it's so important. So sort of laying the groundwork for this part seemed to me a crucial step in talking about the rest of what happens in food and why those changes are so important. To understand the emergence of the neo-bistro movement, often referred to as bistronomy, and why it has been symbolic of energetic change across the food sphere, it's important to first note the distinctions between brasserie and bistrot, the two most well-known Parisian dining categories. Brasseries, elaborately decorated, bustling establishments that offer non-stop daily service from morning to night, were predominantly opened by Alsatians who fled to Paris after the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871, bringing with them local traditions, like the first Bowfinger actually opened in 1864. In fact, the word means brewery, and beer was the drink of choice, served alongside Alsatian specialties like choucroute garnie, sauerkraut, sausages, and smoked meats, steak, sausages, and simple grilled fish. In their heyday, brasseries were the beating heart of the Parisian social world, as much places to be seen as to dine at any hour of the day. But their success didn't last. Longtime local Alexander Lebrano, author of Hungry for Paris, recalls a precipitous decline in the quality at the start of the 1990s, when most of the marquee brasseries like Balzar, La Coupole, and Bowfinger, among others, were snatched up by two big restaurant groups. Mediocrity and flippant attitudes swiftly came to define them. Of this shift, Lebrano writes, "The problem was that behind the scenes it was accountants, not cooks, who edited the menus and order sheets and who eliminated expensive kitchen staff by enthusiastically embracing almost every industrial shortcut devised by France's booming food service industry. Every year, it seemed, there was less real cooking going on behind the swinging doors, maybe just a bit of grilling, frying, and reheating." These unfortunate practices coincided with the home cooking trend of microwavable frozen meals that began in the 1980s and accelerated in the 1990s. Restaurateurs and home cooks alike were rejecting the well-made and homemade for convenience. That mediocrity is still pervasive in brasseries today. They've rested on their laurels and still attracted clients for so long that they subscribe to an attitude of, well, why should we change? We're still working. As I discussed this phenomenon with my friend Arash on a walk one day, he pointed to one such brasserie and said, "This is one of the places that when you come in as a tourist, you say to yourself, oh, this is so Parisian, I want to have this experience. I just want to scream, no you don't eat that, don't put that in your mouth." I couldn't help but laugh because I've seen people fall for the postcard brasserie trap countless times, but it isn't where anyone is going to have the awe-inspiring culinary experiences they so desperately want. Even the more recent Brasserie Barbès, built just beneath the metro tracks of the Barbès-Rochechouart metro station, an ethnically diverse neighborhood with a largely working class and immigrant population, hews to the tradition of style over substance, with prices like €8, nearly $9 for a pint, that exceed what the average Barbès local can afford, and indifferent service. Worse, the owners swooped into the neighborhood posturing that they were going to improve the area, by which they meant gentrify it, and attract moneyed Parisians from other neighborhoods. Though traditional brasseries are for the most part a dying breed, not all hope is lost. Charles Compagnon, a 30-something restaurateur and sommelier with rugged good looks and a shrewd vision for what the food scene in Paris should offer, has been leading the charge with an honest update to the brasserie. Only his interpretation combines elements from several dining categories: all-day service, so morning, noon, and night like a brasserie; pared-back decor, no tablecloths, exposed stone walls, servers in relaxed wear like most neo-bistros across town, with thoughtful market-driven dishes that go well beyond the Alsatian fare served at traditional brasseries. Le Richer, the first of his neo-brasseries, replaced a bistro of the same name that I frequented back in 2009 when I was working a block away. At the time, this stretch of town, where the 10th arrondissement blurs into the 9th, was a dining no-man's land. The bistro, designed to look like a New York steakhouse, trafficked in style but doled out frozen French fries to accompany rubbery steaks with no flavor. When Compagnon took over the space, selected because it was the most affordable placement he could find, the neighborhood came alive.
Okay, so as you can hear, Lindsey's book is a guide, it's a history, it's a celebration of a movement, but it's also a manifesto and an argument. I mean, I love so much having a book that's not afraid to have a point of view and take a stance and say, I don't like Brasserie Barbès at all, and here's why. I think that's so refreshing, Lindsey, and just your honesty and clarity about what you're trying to do is really, really commendable. But what I want to know is, just to start from the beginning, when did you realize that you had something to say that was different, that hadn't been said?
Well, I think it was when I first started blogging. Obviously I had this desire to storytell, but it wasn't until I had a first idea that seemed to be more relevant for a broader audience that I said to myself, I should aim higher. I should maybe try to get these stories into publications that have more international reach. I was not making any mistake about it. My blog was by no means, internationally renowned. So I wanted to aim a little bit higher, and through another writer who has been a mentor to me over the years, she kindly gave me the contact of an editor to try, saying I can't guarantee anything, but if you have this idea, try to run with it. And so I did, and it worked. And then I started proposing other ideas from there that I thought also merited a broader audience and a different type of platform. And that's when I started realizing I had more of those types of stories to tell, more stories that were less maybe about my own personal expat experience, but about what was actually happening on the ground, what some of these developments in food were, what some of the cultural shifts were.
I mean, was this born out of an altruistic impulse? Did you want to save those people that were walking by the bistro and about to go in? Or did you think of it as servicey, or was it, a polemic, or both? Because, I mean, it has such a strong point of view, and that's...
Well, I think it's a little bit of both. I think I had heard enough people, once I was blogging, I was getting emails from people who said, I've come to Paris so many times and have been very disappointed by the meals. And I was like, well, where did you eat? And so it was like, that happened enough where I felt like, okay, something has to be done here. But that was just speaking about food. Some of those other changes, the other changes that I talk about in the book, didn't necessarily sprout or really take shape until later. And so I think it was once I started to put those pieces together and see that there was a bigger picture of what Paris is like, I realized there's a story to be told here. This is sort of a moment to capture in Paris's history, and it hasn't been done yet. And I was sort of like, oh God, I better jump on this fast, or else someone else will do it. And I thought this was the first broad topic that I thought I was able to cover. It was the one that I felt ready to do.
Right, because I mean, we all know that it exists, that there is something different now, but it's been hard to find it all kind of in one place and articulate it in the way that you have. I mean, just your thesis, the people, places, and ideas fueling movement, makes it very clear all of a sudden what it is that we're trying to say to our friends in our long, rambling, and articulate emails when they ask for tips.
But even the people I interviewed, some of them were like, you're right, I hadn't actually thought about the changes in that way, but they're like, now that I think about it, I've seen this, and I'm part of this movement because of X, Y, and Z. And so I think it was, people go about their daily life and they are aware of some of these changes, but maybe didn't know how it fit into something more broadly shifting from a cultural perspective. And so I was starting this discussion with people who were featured in the book and found it to be very encouraging because they sort of felt motivated and inspired by the discussion itself.
Were there any people you approached who didn't want to be in the book, who didn't want to be lumped into this kind of category? Or...
No, I think every single person I spoke to, even some of the fine dining chefs who I wanted to at least speak to have an understanding of how they perceived these dining shifts, were super warm and welcoming and were like, yes, thank you for trying to say something. I mean, that's not to say I'm the only person that said anything, but I think they were like, good luck with this. We do see it happening. And so I didn't really meet much backlash at all. If anything, the only thing that I encountered was someone who didn't show up for their photo to be taken, and so they didn't get their photo in the book, but that's about it.
Right.
So in terms of those research challenges, I didn't have that problem. I had a different problem, which was I had so many fascinating people and to sort of pull from, and people whose stories deserve to be told, that it was like, okay, how do I then choose which to keep, which to put forward in which ways?
Right. And so the book, I mean, as you said, it's not about you. It's not a memoir. It's not a book about your expat experiences. But I would argue there's some kind of embedded, autobiography there. You write, for instance, that when you arrived in Paris, French people had a hard time with kind of multiculturalism, with some of the ethnic food that you were looking for and didn't find. And I was interested in that. Can you give us an example of that and kind of give us the trajectory of your 10 years in Paris and how things have changed?
Yeah, I mean, so food was one of the easy topics to, as a benchmark for, where we were then and where we are now. I mean, if you take the fact that even 10 years ago, okay, you could have Chinese food and Vietnamese food and some of these Asian cuisines, but they were mostly relegated to the neighborhoods that were heavily populated by Chinese immigrants, and And in Belleville, you had some of these Vietnamese places, but they weren't necessarily part of the rest of the dining community. And so I got the sense that this was very much something that the French thought should be separate. It shouldn't mingle and mix with everything else. And there's this idea also that anything that was sort of foreign, so whether it was burgers or American television or British tea shops or whatever, was going to somehow force the French identity and their cultural heritage into decline. And so it was met with a lot of resistance, rather than the thought process being, well, how might some of these imports and some of these sort of foreign ideas, how might they energize the city without taking away from it? And how can the old, all of these treasures we do have, how can that mix with the new? And the new might be a little bit more openness to the other. And so what I always found interesting about that is that right under their noses they have a very multicultural population, and yet they weren't embracing it to the way that they should and that they could have. So all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but over time, I think you have what I say, and I think I mentioned this in the intro, that I think the access to information and social media really played a huge role in how people were perceiving cities and life in cities and the things they wanted to be able to eat and have access to. And I think that was a big shift for people, because suddenly, even if they couldn't go to India or they couldn't make it to Japan, they could still see what was happening in those places and say to themselves, I find this really inspiring, I find this very, creative and intriguing, and why shouldn't we have bits of that in our own culture? And I think the foreign influence and the foreign chefs or creators who have come and made a home for themselves in Paris has done a great thing in terms of just at least opening people up to other ideas and concepts. And so now I see much more of a balance. The city is still very Parisian to me, and that's heightened every time I travel. I go back to the U.S. and I come back and I'm like, no, they really haven't lost their Frenchness. But it's just, I think the new has found a way to harmoniously come together with all of these beautiful cultural products that do deserve to be preserved.
Well, I thought one thing, there was a woman you quoted, maybe you can remind me who she is and what she does, but I thought she made a really good point, which was to say, okay, it may take a while for things to get a foothold here. We're not, our strength is not necessarily our immediate openness to innovation, but once things catch on, we're really good at execution.
Yes, that is 100% true, and that links to the fact that I think French people are generally not so good at risk-taking. Americans, and even I don't know a whole lot about the English, maybe from your experience you can confirm this, but we're just more comfortable with going out on our own and trying new things, and if we fail, that's fine, and we'll pick ourselves back up. But in France, that is the thing not to do. Right. And so I think they really needed to see some ideas confirmed for them, like, okay, this is a concept that works, now we're going to do it, and we're going to do it really well, but we just wanted to see that it was like safe territory to go into. Right. Are there exceptions? Of course, but my sense over the last 10 years, and also having, my own French family, is that risk is a big factor in why change is sometimes slow to
And is that
sprout.
Financial risk? Is it social risk? I was struck by the number of entrepreneurs in your book who said, my family, when I decided, it's like they came home with a business plan and a logo and said, I'm opening a restaurant, and their families were like, you're floundering.
Yeah. Well, because there's so much, the risk of failure is so high, and the costs of having a business, especially a restaurant, are just astronomical. And so I think there's a lot of fear from older generations who say, like, why aren't you going the steady path? Why aren't you staying in your corporate job and seeing where that leads you? Well, that's not necessarily stable either anymore. Those positions are not guaranteed. And so I think they were forced to think of different career paths, or the idea of doing what's now called slashing, which is having, two types of jobs, being, a writer / soap maker, or, whatever it is. That was like unheard of. And when I first went freelance, my in-laws were like, this doesn't seem like such a good idea. Are you really making the right choice? And it's like, well, already as an American, I was like, it's fine, I'll figure it out. But now there's more of an embrace of this.
Did you do that around the time of the financial crisis, the way that you write about a lot of people in the book did, or what?
It was a little bit later. So what happened was, I was told that in 2009, which was after the financial downturn had already started, that in the company I was interning in, I was going to have no full-time position at the end of that. So I start this internship, and I'm told.
And what were you doing?
I was in new business in a branding firm. So branding is like art, logo design and packaging design, and I didn't really know what I was going to do at that point. I was just like, please God, let me get a job after this. And I was told from day one, like, don't get any big ideas. And so that was already difficult for me, someone who, having come out of grad school, was like, I need to try to get my foot in the door and have some sort of formal corporate experience. And I did end up doing that, but I ended up doing it part-time, and so that allowed me to write on the side, and it's sort of one of these, rare gifts from the French corporate world, where half the time you have to be, or most of the time you have to be a parent or a mother who because of the childcare works 4 out of 5 days a week. Mine was simply because one of the assignments I was working on could only afford me for 4 out of the 5 days, and so that 5th day really allowed me to pursue a lot of projects. But that's a rarity. So it wasn't until I finally had this idea, and I finally felt like I was ready to, see what I could do with writing or consulting or doing these things full time, that I sort of ripped that Band-Aid, and in 2015 said, yeah, I have to leave this now.
Right.
But even then, even after several years, it was still like, oh God, is this gonna pan out? And there is a level of that I as you say, people were sort of concerned about the steps they were taking, but I think our generation, this creative class, has to do this to feel like they're not going to sink in this economy. And fortunately, people are back to consuming handcrafted goods and better made goods, and trying to resist some of this mass consumption that we're that's a universal problem, but I think that resistance opened up opportunities for some of these young people who were ready to, take on businesses of their own.
Right. I mean, give us now that you are a full-time writer and you're, master of your time and space. Give us kind of a day in the life of Lindsey Tramuta. I mean, are these kinds of places, are these kinds of people woven into the fabric of your everyday? I mean, should I check? Are you wearing a shirt from H&M, or is it?
No, it's not. No, I do think that through researching and speaking to so many individuals, I saw that there was sort of a red thread through everything, which was just that we need to be eating better, consuming better, and if that means we're paying a little bit more but buying less, then we should be doing that. That would just be better. And I felt like for some of these people to say that, and to say like, we may not have that much expendable income or disposable income, we're not as flush as some of the other European countries, or even in the U.S. where people just seem to have buckets of money to spend. We're still going to be wiser with what we're buying, and that really had an impact on me. I think also when I went full-time freelance, I now have my own financial considerations to make, and so their sentiment was very appealing. Not just appealing, but it really resonated with me.
But I mean, a lot of this is about your neighborhood in a sense.
Oh, for
too.
sure. I mean,
You get up in the morning and go have, what's the word? Not artisanal, but how would you describe the coffee? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, drinkable.
Drinkable coffee.
Good coffee. Yeah, and I mean
daily.
Usually, if it's not first thing in the morning, it's at 4 o'clock when I decide to get dressed and make my way out. But no. The 11th arrondissement is sort of, I look at it as being, almost ground zero for a lot of this this movement. And so, of course, I'm fortunate to have just landed in this neighborhood and seen everything sprout around me, which has been, both wonderful, exciting, inspiring. And so, yeah, for coffee, I have a lot of choice. A part of this book was written at Café Oberkampf, which is in the 11th arrondissement. So that was... I found a sense of community there, like in a lot of these places, that I think is almost quintessentially Parisian. People go to those corner cafes and those bistros because they want to feel like they're part of something, even if they don't speak to anybody. And these spaces also in the book have very much served that purpose.
Right.
And I knew I could go in and I would have my lunch and I would have my coffee and I would work, and I would see French people come in, I would see visitors come in, people from all over, and they were sort of all having a good time, and that just motivated me further.
And do these people who are involved in different sectors of the new Parisian economy, I mean, all these different areas you mentioned, do they have a sense of belonging, of being a part of something? I mean, do they all kind of know each other?
There's a lot of camaraderie, I'd say, especially in the food business. I'm not so sure that, some of the crafters have much opportunity to cross paths in the same way, but certainly everybody in the wine world knows each other, and all the chefs go to a certain selection of restaurants and bars after hours. And I think, if you are frequenting these places, you're going to run into these people, and I think it's been very positive. I know that in the U.S. there's perhaps more competition and there's a little bit more rivalry, and I don't get that sense here.
Right.
I think everyone's sort of in support of each other, and when one cafe loses a staffer, they call on their network of other cafe owners to help them find a replacement, or at least have suggestions. And I think that helps everybody move forward.
Right. I mean, I feel like they should all have a New Paris sticker in the window now, because
I'm sure we could make it.
It seems like there's a kind of unifying spirit. One question, I mean, a lot of the book is on the right bank. Is the New Paris coming for the parts of Paris that haven't changed as much, or?
I mean, I do see that starting. I think, for one, it was bound to happen, and there's only so much retail and restaurant space in the 10th, 11th, and 18th arrondissement. So, of course, they're going to have to move outward. But no, I think there's this desire, even among fine dining chefs who have opened up more affordable, steakhouses or brasseries or bistros, and they maybe choose to do that on the left bank where they already have sort of a loyal client base, but they're still offering something that's more accessible, and I think that's a good way to start. We need some of these more established people, whether it's in fashion or whatever, to bring that spirit over. And Alain Ducasse has been actually a huge supporter of all of these young people creating or cooking or whatever, and has helped support this movement all across Paris. So I think that's the next step.
Right. One thing that interested me too is implicit in some of the stuff you're saying is a certain kind of politics, saying we should buy better but less frequently, perhaps. I mean, very aligned, for one thing, with Anne Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris, and some of her ideas. Can you talk about, the last chapter is very interesting because, it's not just restaurants and where to go, it's kind of also about urban space and how people occupy it. Why did you decide to include that?
Because to me that was undeniably one of the big areas of change. If you look at Hidalgo's plans to ban cars along both sides of the Seine now, because the what is it, Parc Rive de Seine is now officially open. I mean, that is huge, and it angered a lot of people. But she has the right ideas, and I think that that plus the way that cultural spaces were moving to, the extremities of the city. You have the Philharmonic in Villette. You have the Fondation Louis Vuitton in Boulogne. How often are tourists really going to go to both sides of the city in that way? And I think it not only brings locals out to the extremities, but it brings visitors, of course. So for me, there was that, plus the fact that I was noticing, where are people hanging out? If it's not outside and it's not in coffee shops, where is it? Well, hotels, boutique hotels have actually become, again, a space for Parisians to get together and have a drink, and I thought that was very interesting. Just the way Parisians inhabit space in the city was just something I couldn't ignore, because I was also part of that. I was going to these spaces to hang out, and I was being invited to have a drink here or there that was not in a traditional restaurant or bar, and so I thought it was important to include because it's as much part of the city's changing cityscape as any of the other factors.
Right. I mean, I love the way you get into even some elements of urban planning, talking about the Grand Paris plan, and also remind me what the initiative is called, but the program by which different arrondissements are actually targeting bringing in these kinds of businesses. They're kind of real estate.
Right.
Rates,
so there's
right?
Semaest, which is an entity which I guess is spearheaded by the city, but then they have local in each arrondissement entities that have either certain properties that are owned by the city and that then can be rented out by young entrepreneurs or creators with strong business ideas at less expense. So either I think it's the pas de porte, or the fee to enter basically is waived, and that's a huge help for a lot of upstarts. So yeah, each neighborhood, not all of them, but certain neighborhoods are trying to bring in stronger business. Push out some of the these sort of wholesale shops that haven't really created a sense of community. Those have mostly moved to Aubervilliers, where they're sort of centralized. And I think that is a valuable effort.
And so, it isn't random. There is an ideology and a kind of structure behind it. Do you think there's a downside? Are there people who could object to that and say, why has the debate over gentrification not surrounded the new Paris the way it has perhaps in Brooklyn or...
Well, I thought of that, and that question has come up before, and obviously gentrification is not always a negative thing. I don't, in some cases, yes. If I look at the area in the Marais around Hôtel de Ville and BHV, for example, that has gentrified to a point of sort of nauseating commercialism.
Right.
And there I feel a genuine loss of community. You see independent shops have just, almost entirely vanished from that part of town. But that's not true everywhere. Things just take longer here. I'd say when you talk about, people love to compare, first of all, Paris and New York City or Brooklyn, and I think these comparisons shouldn't really be made because they don't have the same infrastructure, they don't have the same rate of change, they don't have the same policies.
Right.
And so I think that Paris has taken so long for some of these things to develop that we're now only starting to maybe see in what ways they might one day be harmful. But I also think that there's a lot of good that's happening, and I think that the city has done a good job so far of keeping, even in some of these areas where there's a lot of new business and some of these creative spots that are you might consider very hip, of preserving what else was there before that also were of value.
Right.
If you look at the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Denis, that's one example of, you look at the Daily Syrian, which is frequented by both people that might be considered hipster, but also locals who have lived there for 25 years. You have greengrocers and cheese shops with nicer and not so nice restaurants. I just think that's a street that shows how it can be done, where you can still preserve what was there and not force people out. But I think it's a question that's gonna, it's going to come up further, especially as we talk about the Grand Paris project, which will hopefully broaden the delineation of Paris.
Right.
What is considered Paris and how do people engage with it?
Well, and on a slightly more macro scale, France elected Emmanuel Macron president on Sunday night. And, with the US and the UK both in certain ways turning more inward and isolationist, what do you think are the prospects for this sort of reestablishment of French cultural influence? I mean, you write about how, you know, some of the resistance to trying new ideas was born out of a sense of fear and loss of stature.
Mm-hmm.
But so yeah, talk a little bit about, you know, we have a new Paris. Is there a prospect now for a new France?
Well, I mean, I think that his win sends a very strong message to the world, first and foremost. Now, whether he will be able to do what he wants to do is a whole other question. He needs to win a lot of parliamentary seats. He needs to gather support from both sides. So we have to already see if this is not going to be just a stalling of the inevitable rise of the right, which could come 5 years down the road. Hopefully he will not be that person. He's not a savior either, which is often how, you know, his naysayers have portrayed him as, oh, he's coming in, you know, like he's going to save France. I think what I do like about him and what I do respect about him is his openness, his global perspective, and just how supportive he has been of new business, of startups, of entrepreneurs. I work for myself, so
Right.
a lot of his policies that concern people who work for themselves are of direct concern to me. So I want him to succeed. I think time will tell whether he will be a more important symbol for France and not just the guy who, put off Le Pen and the National Front for a little bit longer. So I think it's too early to tell, but I feel like we have at least some hope.
But I mean, apropos of your book, for instance, you know, he made that appeal to, for instance, American scientists and entrepreneurs, saying, "Come to France. It's your homeland now." And that, you know, made me wonder. I mean, you wrote how internationalism really has gained so much ground in Paris since you first moved here, and so I wanted you to talk a little bit about the interplay between Parisian entrepreneurs and people like many of the people in the audience tonight who are immigrants, who are expats. Like, what is the dialogue there? What do we have to offer to this new movement in Paris, other than being overly fussy customers who, you know, want their salad dressing on the side or can't find kale juice or whatever?
Well, I think the the advantage of some of the foreign creatives in Paris, or just the foreign business-minded people, is that they see the gaps in the market, and not that they see gaps that are like, oh, here's, you know, just something we can market to the French. It's more like, here's opportunity, and they are probably better suited to see that opportunity as outsiders. Just like some of this, I was maybe able to see more than someone who's lived in Paris their whole lives and maybe don't pay attention to those things. Just like as a Philly native, I didn't necessarily pay attention to a lot of what was happening under my nose. I think I get the sense that what's been, really refreshing to see is how the French entrepreneurs, whether it's in food or, you know, or crafting or tech, how they've embraced the skills of foreign workers. So whether it's, you know, having a business partner who's Australian or American, there's a lot of that in that cultural mixing, which I mean, that's really positive. The French have a lot to bring to the table, beyond just being able to work the bureaucratic system. Australians, Americans, you know, people from all over the world have a lot of value that they can add. And so whether it's bringing a little bit of their culture into whatever they're doing in Paris, or it's actually bringing a unique skill set that the French don't have, there's value. But I don't see it as being competitive in the way that maybe it was perceived in the beginning.
Right.
No one's taking away, you know, from French people doing the exact same thing.
Right. So it's moved to a more.
I think it's very collaborative and harmonious. You know, maybe some business owners will say, you know, oh well, that Australian I worked with once, you know, that was a nightmare. Right. But I get the sense that they see what each bring to the table, and that can only help sort of nurture this culture of collaboration and creativity and push it forward.
And just, I think, final question probably, and then we'll let the audience ask some, but you know, this scene is so vibrant and it's moving so fast. I mean, even since you finished the book, since you turned in the manuscript, are there things that you've, no, I mean, what would you, if you were adding kind of an afterword today, what else would you say?
Oh, I mean, so many things. I mean, even just this, a greater concern around sustainability, both in food practices, in concepts that are going to be launching, that I know are going to be launching, that make their sort of core message around not zero waste, but consuming less, or, you know, or having less waste in general. And I think that's, you know, that picks up from where Hidalgo has, you know, begun her campaign for a better and greater city, and I think that's something that started sort of just after it was too late for me to add anything else in.
Yeah, I noticed on your blog you were getting into a little, was it balcony gardening or? Oh yeah,
I mean there's all sorts of things, people really trying to connect with green spaces in whatever way they can, but that's good. This is supposed to be a moment, a pivotal moment, but that's going to continue moving, and so it just means more stuff to document, and that's really exciting.
Okay, fantastic. I am gonna be quiet now and let some other people ask questions. Who wants to start?
I think the second part is the question you have about, you know, sort of, is this, you know, the fact that he describes when you go to a restaurant and you sit down and someone comes over and says, do you want something to drink? And then it's 2 hours before they come back to your table, or, you know, an exceedingly long time. I think that's true of a certain stripe of restaurant in Paris. More and more, some of the places actually that are talked about in this book have a more either Anglo-Saxon or just normal level of service that where you don't have to fight for these things. So I think, I mean, if you just roll up to any of these, big box brasseries, as I would call them, or or corner cafes, yeah, you're going to still have to fight. I kind of think that's exciting in a way. Occasionally, it's like, because that's so Parisian to me, like this level of challenge in everyday sort of situations.
Because they don't understand service.
Well, but I think at this point so much negativity has been around the service, and if you're not careful, tourists are going to stop coming because you're mean to them and they're in your cabs. You won't tell them how to get to where they're going. And so there's been a lot of awareness around this. And so in the restaurant space, I think there's been a lot of positive behavioral shifts. Taxis still leave a little bit to be desired, but that's because they, I think they just can.
But
they can
so
get
many
away with
people
it.
in your book have worked and lived abroad
That's
as well.
the-
I mean,
yeah.
that's a real generational distinction, it seems to me.
That's true, and they if they come back, to Paris to start something up, they've seen the brighter side in terms of service, and I think they realize that there are enough foreigners coming into this city that they need to
Right.
make a little bit more effort in that way. See, I would have hoped that would improve a bit, but they're still very proud of their language. I
Wait,
think.
maybe repeat the question.
Okay, so she just said that she speaks other languages, and she's been to other cultures where when you're learning, people are kind of patient with you, but that's not so much the case here. So in terms of language, is there resistance to English? I'm gathering is sort of your.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's still true. I've seen it improve quite a bit, partially because I see so many foreigners now working in a lot of these businesses. And so I think
So you can run a successful business in Paris and not speak French.
Well, I mean, the case with some of these, some of them have partners
Okay.
that do, that help them.
They do the French speaking. You
Right.
speak all the French. I'll do everything else.
Right. I know from even interviewing people for this book that that some of the Japanese pastry chefs were not very comfortable in French or English. It was just sort of, they probably have someone behind the scenes who helps them with some of that, the actual logistics. But yeah, I think there's still a lot of pride. If you look at a lot of the storefronts in Paris, more and more French-run businesses are choosing English names for things, and I don't necessarily see that as being overwhelmingly positive, but it doesn't help the cause, right? It doesn't help French people feel like Americans or Anglos are not sort of invading their space. But I do think that if the key is to make an effort, and you've made it, you sound like someone who's trying to make the effort to speak French, and I think ultimately that's what they appreciate, even if they can't continue that conversation with you entirely in English. I don't know if that answers your question. I think it's still, yeah, I mean, in a way I'm sort of glad Paris still remains Paris in a way, and they don't try to change everything, but I know that can be frustrating when you're still learning. So the question involves food trucks and street food, and what is its, is it prevalent? What is the impact on mealtime, and has it sort of encouraged people to eat more on the go? Food trucks were sort of almost like a test run for food entrepreneurs who wanted to eventually have fixed restaurant space. Kristen Frederick, who had Le Camion qui Fume, which is the one who sort of started this whole food truck discussion, she knew that you had to have, for the operation to fully work and to be profitable, you would need a multitude of trucks, right, to make that run often. The reality also is that permits are somewhat hard to come by. You don't have that much flexibility in where you can roam. So you have to sort of set up a schedule, and that's what she did and continues to do. But her ultimate goal was to use that as sort of a testing space for her concept to begin with, knowing full well that she was eventually going to open a restaurant. Other businesses that followed suit and opened food trucks almost all of the ones that I've spoken to have either they closed because it was they couldn't financially make it work, or they've all gone into permanent restaurant space. Where you still see some people doing just food trucks is at La Défense in the business district for music festivals, areas where you're going to have a mass of people who need to get something to eat and quite quickly. I still think that to-go business is minute compared, in terms of its impact on the way people are consuming. Yes, they're maybe consuming more quickly, but I even see people who will, go to a food truck or go to a place that's, sort of casual fast food where you can eat in or take it to go, and they'll go sit in a park or they'll go sit, on the steps of a church and they'll eat. They'll still sit down. You don't really see people physically eating while walking. And even when it comes to coffee, I know that the to-go business alone represents less than 10% of their business. So when I was just in the U.S. and I see the way Americans go in and go out, and they, they'll get their lunch to go, they'll pick up a coffee, and then they'll go wherever, probably back to their desk. That's just not common here, because the pause should somehow be in your day. Even if it's only for 15 minutes, you should be pausing. And so that's sort of, I'm pleased to see that these more casual eats hasn't had an adverse effect on the way they're consuming. I'm sure that, from a societal perspective, people are spending less time around the table, but I think that's less to do with the street food and casual food eats and more to do with just the way our lives are going, the pace of life.
Well, and even in something like Chipotle in Paris, I mean, there's a totally, Mexican concept in Paris, but you can get they always have coffee. I mean, people are having even, multiple stage meals in a Chipotle, which you're not going to see.
No.
So, yeah.
Just a quick follow-up, and I appreciate your comments, but I'm thinking, in as much as I've observed, Paris really keen on what New York's doing, and I take your point about not making them, but just in that more imitative way, and we see Brooklyn exhibits and Marché and stuff like that. So now there's this kind of haute cuisine within food trucks, and that's really what I'm getting at too, where you can get a fish taco and 25 euro lobster roll, these kind of things. Are you seeing part of that?
So her question was how
get greater access because there's not the overhead to it. So is the food quality actually elevating in any of the?
So she asked if haute cuisine has sort of made its way into this street food truck format. I don't think it's as advanced or elevated as what it is in what I've seen in the U.S., in New York or Los Angeles, where first of all, those concepts are very mature and have existed for so long that they can try new things and have a ready audience. I still think there would be some suspicion from some French diners to eat something, unless there was, Alain Ducasse or Thierry Marx or some of these more known, respected haute cuisine names behind it. But what I will say, to your point, is that the Neo Bistro type restaurant, whether it's actually, revisiting French food or it's, Korean barbecue or whatever it is, that in that casual space, people are getting better quality, accessible food. And that's what I think was such a giant shift, was that this whole gap in the middle where, it's not, 50 to 100 euros to eat a meal, nor is it under 10 euros, but it's this space in the middle where you're going to get better quality food, and often it's, very market fresh, very good ingredients. And I think that has been the greatest change, and where you're going to find maybe some of these more gastronomic ambitions in a casual format. That's a very good one, because of course that is bound to come up. Is it really just, is this for expats who want to have an expat-friendly hangout? I think there's still that division to a degree, but what I've seen is that at certain moments of the week, for example, I'm more likely to go to maybe an Anglo-run coffee shop and hear only French people. And at certain points of the week, probably when, foreigners are either in school or have more flexible schedules, are going to be frequenting the same space. I think it depends where you're going, when you're going, and where it is. What I like also about the places I did choose is that for the most part, they may have started off, especially if they're like entirely American run, for example, they may have started off with a predominantly American client base. But over time, once I think Parisians see like, oh, this is something that's getting a lot of traction, it seems really interesting, I've read about it a lot, then they go. So I frequent the same, or I experience the same thing you're describing, but I also experience the other side, which is depending on the places I'm going, or even the ones that I've included, I'm still met with a very mixed audience. And some of the places, even some of the coffee shops I know, have now sort of shifted to be more French than they are Anglo. So I think it's a case-by-case basis, but I was not targeting expats specifically, or sort of the Anglo market by writing this. I think that what I see coming out in the French press is a lot of this.
Something I just want to point out about Lindsey, and her book also, is that Lindsey's French is excellent and is no barrier to Lindsey discovering things around. I mean, I just think that makes a really big difference in your reporting and your writing and your awareness of what's going on, because I do think a lot of times the things that you read in English speaking in Anglophone media, sometimes it's because X, Y, or Z restaurant is the best new thing going on, but other times it's because the person who wrote it speaks English and so does the chef, and it's, out of a little bit of laziness maybe, but just proximity and awareness. And I do think that's something that really distinguishes Lindsey is her, immersion in both the French-speaking and English-speaking cultures in the city.
And I will say that I wouldn't have been able to talk to a whole number of people for this book if I wasn't able to dialogue with them exclusively in French, because they just would not have been able to tell me their stories properly in English. So, but I hear you. I know that there's still a lot of, Anglos will go where they feel comfortable too. So.
But they also go to the places they read about.
And they read about, yes.
Just the places that happen to have people who speak English.
Right.
So, yeah, I think this is like a real trove of new ideas for that reason.
I did not talk about that. I think that's a whole nother book. And certainly the French could really use the help.
No, I don't think so. But
oh, you don't think so?
Oh, no.
Okay.
No, I'm afraid of that, in one sense. But,
so, well, I would distinguish.
It is an industry now where American writers are imported to teach the French how to create television in the American manner, which might be 15 people in a room writing one script and organizing shows so that you can get them out in a regular,
quickly,
orderly manner.
I will say that's not at all my area of expertise, but I believe you that it's happening, for sure.
Let's do one more. Just one more.
Well, it's not so much a question as it is a series of statements. The first thing is, until about 2 weeks ago, I didn't know who you were. And it might have been your article or an article in the New Yorker or the New York Times that got me to the book. And so Joyce wants to go out to go find some place to eat, and all I'm doing is cataloging places we have to go. It took forever, and it was just a really short article, so there must be a lot of meat in there.
Yeah, I think you can take a photo of the appendix that has all of the addresses, and it's just like, if you can't send everybody the meaty bits, you can at least send them the addresses.
So I both want to
saving some work.
It's well organized though. I mean, there's a bit in the back that gives you just, the nitty gritty. You can flip to the back and look at the rest.
Whether it was you who wrote the article or one of your colleagues, I mean, clearly there's a lot in there. And the next thing is just the quality both of your questioning and of your responses, way above normal. And I want to congratulate you both.
Thank you so much.
I'm so glad we got on
Very good to end on. Thank you both very much.
Thank you so much.